Today we're continuing on with Unfinished Tales with the description of the island of Numenor. If you're new here, welcome to Heart of a Halfling. We talk about Lord of the Rings and do some Lord of the Ring things. So let's get started. So, with the description of the island of Numenor, first things off, the island is in the shape of a star, and it's just slightly angled a little bit. I'm not a map maker, so I'm going to do my best here to kind of give you a rough idea of what the island of Numenor would kind of look like. And, of course, drawing a star without any guidelines can be challenging, but we shall do our best. So the island of Numenor is broken up into 5, and then the center, with the center being about 200 miles from east to west and north to south. And the center, it has no coast except for this one spot here, right here, which is the city Romana. And this will therefore be the Bay of Romana. And this will be the Numenorians' main port to sailing to Middle-earth. The most important part of this section of Numenor, which this section is called Matalmar, is that in the center, or near the center of this section, we have Matalmar, which is the largest mountain on Numenor. And the top part of it is flat, more of a plateau. We have a valley down here. And what makes this mountain interesting is that it has sort of mountains coming out from it that lead to each point of Numenor. Now, this mountain is important because this is where the Numenorians would go to pray to Eru, to try to get the attention of the Valar. This is where they would go, and Tolkien describes it as being a very silent, a very reverent place, that if you as a stranger were dropped into Numenor and had no context of anything, you would know to stay quiet when you got onto Matalmar. So on Matalmar, people were allowed to climb whenever they wanted. They could only climb so high. The mountain had sort of a spiral going around it up to a certain point. At the top is where the eagles, there would be 3 eagles, that's where they resided. So you only got to climb so high. And during most of the year, if you went up there to pray, the eagles would come down and sort of rest in front of you to listen to what you had to say, and then they would go and carry it off to Manwë. But there were 3 times of the year that would be led by the king, and they were points of celebration. So the king would lead all the Numenorians up to the mountain, and they would give praise and gratitude to Eru Ilúvatar. And during this time, the eagles would fly above everyone rather than sitting before them. So that was an important part. And because this is so important, we have a city right here called Armenelos. And this is where the king would reside. So this ends up being a very important part of Matalmar and Numenor in total. So this section sort of right in here will end up being known as Arendor. So within Matalmar, the center area, we have another section called Arendor. And this is where the king would reside. This is sort of the most populated area of all of Numenor. And within this area of Arendor, we have this little point right here in that valley next to Matalmar is called Norinan. And this was where the kings would be buried. So all of that is in Arendor, which is in Matalmar. Now, coming from Norinan, we have a river. We have a river that kind of swirls and leads down to the ocean, named Cyril. Also in Matalmar, we have another river that sort of takes place in both Matalmar and in Autostar, which we'll get to. And this river is called the Duine. And a part of this river is a little lake right here that is named Nisanen. Now, the last thing to note about Matalmar is that there is a patch of land right in here, a little bit in this section, that's all grassy, and it was called Emerie. And this patch of land is where most of the sheep would be herded. So we'll come to see that most of Numenor is pretty mountainous, and if it's not mountainous, it's quite grassy, but a majority of the sheep are tended to right in here. So now moving on, we'll move up north to Photostar. Now within Photostar, we have a lot of mountains. Photostar is not somewhere that a lot of people are able to live because of how mountainous and stony it is. But we do have one little city right about here named Andosto. So the last sort of geographical note about Photostar is its North Cape. But that is about it for Photostar. So moving on, we have Autostar. Now, Autostar is also quite mountainous, not to the extent that Photostar is, but it does still carry on the mountain range down into here. And within Autostar, we have our next city right about in there, named Andunier. Now, what's special about Andunier is that the name means sunset, because right from here is where you would see the most beautiful sunsets in all of Numenor. This is the part that's facing most towards Aman, and so the view is just gorgeous there. And so it ends up being a more popular space. And because of that, Autostar has all of these bays. And this one, where Andunier is the largest of those bays. And so it is called, no surprise, the Bay of Andunier. Now, the last part of Autostar is a little forest right about here. And within this forest, we have our next city right around here. And this city is named Eldolande. And therefore, this big area is called the Bay of Eldolande. Now, what's special about this place is that this is where all the Teleri would come in, and they would sail into Eldolande. So this forest right here that's called Nissamaldar. Because all the Teleri would come here, they would bring all sorts of riches, seeds, all sorts of things to this forest. And this is the most beautiful forest of all of Numenor. Here, there would be plants that couldn't be matched anywhere else, that were just beautiful, lush, colorful. They were named after different Valar. It was one of the most beautiful places in Numenor. The other thing that's special about this is that because the Teleri would come here, they would bring all of their gems and pearls and beautiful stones all to Eldolande. So this is where all of the riches of Numenor would really be found. And the reason why that's special is that Numenor doesn't have any of those things. It doesn't have any gems or stones or any of those sorts of items. And so whenever the Teleri would bring that in, it was a very special commodity. So moving on, we have our next section of the island named Hayarnustar. Now, there's not much going on in this part of Numenor. It is also another mountainous area. So then the next thing of note in this area, we come back to Cyril, which has sort of all these little breaking points, and that makes this area quite marshy. We have a nice little bit of marshland right here. There is one settlement or city right about here. Named Nindamos. But as far as Harnustar, there's nothing really else here. It has a lot of grassy land, but most of it's really concentrated up towards the Matalmar. So moving on, coming to the southeast land, we have Autostar. Now, what's special about this place is also that it has a beautiful forest, but most of this is forest. So what's special about this forest is that here it grows the Lornique. And this tree, the people of Numenor delighted in because it grew clusters of yellow flowers that, to the people of Numenor, resembled the tree Lorlin, one of the tree of Valinor. And the people of Numenor would sort of make folklore and believe that the trees here were maybe a part of or seedlings from the tree of Valinor, but there was no truth in that. It was just something that the people of Numenor liked to talk about. One of the things I forgot to mention about Nissamaldar is that this forest grew the Malnorni tree, or the Malorn tree that we see in Lothlorien. So what happened is that the sixth king of Numenor gives a gift to King Gilgalad of Lindon, the seeds of the Malorn tree, and he's unable to grow them in Lindon, so he gives them to Galadriel, who's able to grow them in Lothlorien. And the trees that we see in Lothlorien, which are massive, they're large and gorgeous trees, do not match in the girth of the trees in Numenor. Now to our last section of Numenor. This is called Autostar. Now, there's not much going on in Autostar because it is the coldest part of Numenor. However, even though it is the coldest part, it technically could be colder because these mountains right here protect part of Autostar or from the harsh winds. So the final thing to note about the geography of Numenor is that it has one road that goes from Romena to Ameneros to Norenan, the Tombs of Kings, all the way up to Andosto, and finally to Andunier. So the reason why there's not more roads in Numenor is that the people of Numenor really loved their horses and would rather ride their horses everywhere that they would go. So there wasn't a lot of roads in Numenor. It said that the people of Numenor actually grew very close relations with their horses in the same way that we see depicted in the Lord of the Rings movies with Aragorn and the horse. That's sort of the same relation that we see with horses and people in Numenor. So there's only one road for sort of necessity of getting between these cities. But if there was any large cargo that needed to be traveled, they would actually go by sea. Now, the final thing about Numenorians in general is that they did not make a lot of weapons. It wasn't part of their culture to make weapons. The king would have a sword and he would have a sword made for his heir, but otherwise weapons were not a big deal until much later in the history of Numenor. So that's everything. It's a general knowledge of the geography of Numenor to let us be able to read the next story of Eldarion and Orendis. I hope this was helpful to everybody. I know that when I'm reading a lot about geography in Middle Earth, that's very helpful to have a map, and I thought this might be a fun way to go through this section. So I hope everyone enjoyed this. I hope that you all have a wonderful, blessed week and that you return next week as we continue through Unfinished Tales. And as always, may your homes be filled with food and cheer. Bye!